Hope you're all staying safe. I'm going to be reading from this book, The Accidental Prime Minister. This was a book from my class that we never got to finish, so I'm going to carry on from chapter 9. So far, Joe has been made the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and his best friend AJ as well. And now he's just about to go into a board meeting. Chapter 9. Next morning landed with a thud as Joe fell out of bed once again. He scratched his head. What was that noise? And Joe opened the window on a group of workmen drilling and shouting instructions to each other, while a big yellow digger dug and shifted huge piles of dirt in the garden. Would you mind keeping it down? Joe asked. Sorry, lad. Some clowns got us building a roller coaster in the garden. Oh, well, you carry on then, Joe said, closing the window. Joe yawned and gazed across the bedroom. I could get used to this, he thought. More chips, AJ shouted in his sleep, waking himself up. You had enough chips last night, Joe said, looking down at AJ on the camp bed, next to Joe's huge four-poster bed. There was a knock at the door and Jenkins entered. Prime Minister, you must get dressed. The cabinet meeting is about to start. Of course, I need to save the park, said Joe. Well, it's not just about the park, sir. It's about running the country, Jenkins said. Well, I guess. But what else should I do? Joe said. Well, pass some laws. That's usually how it goes, Jenkins said, sighing as well. Laws? Joe looked at AJ, smiling. Oh yeah, we'll pass some laws. And they both began to laugh hysterically. The cabinet room was packed. There were 30 or so men and women crammed in, all staring at Joe. Good morning, Minister, Joe said, grinning. Good morning, Prime Minister, they all said back at him, in a slow, robotic way kids do in assembly. Joe was starting to get used to being called Prime Minister, even though it still made him giggle a bit inside. It's worth pointing out at this point what a minister actually is. It's a posh name for a person who works with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the person in charge of all the ministers. Forgive me if you know all of this, but it never hurts to explain things, does it? Say, for instance, you wanted to do something about schools. Say, for some reason, you wanted a day when the teachers get to be the pupils and the pupils get to be the teachers. I don't know, every month? Then you get the education minister to figure out all the details. That's code for getting that person to do all the work. And if it's a success, the Prime Minister takes all the credit. And if it doesn't, well, we will just blame the minister in charge. That's it. In essence, how the government works. Now, where were we? Oh yes, first day of school. First day of cabinet. Can I just say, on behalf of all of us, we are delighted to have you as our new leader, said a slimy-haired, pasty-faced man near the front. By pasty, I mean he had a pale face. He did not have a face like a hot, meaty snack. Thanks, and, who are you? Joe asked. My name is George Irwin. I am First Lord Chancellor of the Exchequer. Say what now? Joe inquired. George Irwin looked more than a bit put out. He was a man not used to being unknown. There were a few sniggers from other ministers. Is something funny? Joe asked, innocently. Sorry, Prime Minister. Sir, it was Darcy from Environment, said another minister, pointing to a lady with hair so big it looked as though it had been sculptured out of a hedgerow. Don't you say that, Peters. You were laughing too, she said. Hush now, or you'll all have to stay in when it's playtime, Joe joked. Jenkins whispered something in Joe's ear. What? Joe said. Well, I've just been informed that you don't get playtime. Well, I say we have morning play, afternoon play, and lunch play. Joe looked around the room. Can someone make that into a law, please? Already done. It came from a distant voice down the corridor. Now, where were we? Oh yes, Lord of the Checkers. What do you do? Exchequer, sir, George Irwin said desperately, trying not to shout. Before sighing and adding, it means I'm in charge of the money. AJ whispered something in Joe's ear. AJ, just to be sure he hadn't been misheard, and AJ nodded. Okay, AJ and I would like you to see the money, if that's okay. We want to, check it's all there. Well, I don't have it on me, the Chancellor said. Well, obviously, Joe said. I'm not that silly. So where is it? Is it in your office? Is it under your bed? Joe laughed. Well, no, it's, it's... What, you don't know? Joe said. Well, yes, of course I know, George Irwin said. Look, if you don't know where all the cash is, just say you can be honest, Joe insisted. No, I'm sure I do know where it is. I think, actually, I don't know where it all is, he said, scratching his head. Would it be okay if I just popped out, go and check we haven't lost all the money? Joe nodded. That's probably a good idea, Joe said. Anybody else need to go and find anything? Check we haven't lost track of any battleships, misplaced a hospital or three, accidentally dropped a couple of prisoners down the back of the sofa. Several ministers, desperate not to catch anyone's eye, tiptoed out after George Irwin. Right, said Joe, clapping his hand. Let's get started. My name's Joe, and I'm your Prime Minister. I'm super excited about that, obviously. First thing, let's get a few laws going, shall we? We have playtime for ministers now. All those in favour of expanding it to everyone, raise your arm. Good, Joe said, without even bothering to do a count. Also, I say we have a fancy dress day at least once a week. People in suits always look so sad. Let's have a fancy dress Friday, but on a Thursday. And I think jelly should be free on the NHS. And let's make it illegal to have those comb-over haircuts. You know, the ones where people have clearly gone bald, but they insist of combing their hair. At this point, several members of the cabinet put their hand over their heads, trying to hide their awful comb-overs. I think we should have one day a month where the teachers get to be the pupils and the pupils get to be the teachers. Let's start that tomorrow. He grinned. I'd like to fund research into finding out once and for all what happens to odd socks. It's, and I think I can speak for everyone, a problem that has blighted society for far too long. I suggest we replace the handshake with a more modern high five and have more dogs hanging out of car windows. If we could get that policy rolling out as soon as possible, that would be great. And I'd also like to expand Britain's space program to include sending a cow to Venus. If we don't do it, someone else will. And last but not least, I want to save the park by my house. Well, not just one, but all the parks. Who's in charge of parks again? The door creaked open and Violetta walked in, and Joe watched the atmosphere of the room suddenly shift, as if someone turned a dial from lovely and happy to eek. That would be me, Violetta said, raising her eyebrow. Oh yeah, how could I forget? Well, Violet. Can I call you Violetta? No. Well, what do I call you? Joe asked. AJ whispered something unrepeatable in a children's book into Joe's ear. Now, I know you and I have our differences, but what say we put those aside and see if we can, well, Joe gulped, work together like friends. Friends? Friends? I'm not being friends with you. Why on earth would I want to save parks where they can be? Violetta said, why on earth would I want to save parks when they can be sold for cash? Well, parks are fun, AJ said. Well, who cares about fun? Violetta said. I do, said Joe. In fact, I think everyone should have as much fun as possible. I mean, why is it only kids that play in parks? Why don't we have special swings and slides for the grown-ups too? Let's make it a new law. I'm talking bouncy castles, climbing frames, big twizzly slides, and that would be it. We should have a big reopening of the park. Let's do it. Everyone in the room nodded and smiled, apart from Violetta. Now you want grown-ups having fun too, she said. I take it you're not in favour of my idea, Joe sighed. But you are forgetting that I am the Prime Minister, so I can sort of save the park anyway. The room shifted uneasily. No one had ever stood up to Violetta Crumb before. The whole room held its breath and waited for her to explode. But she didn't. She didn't say a word. She just smiled. Well, I say smile. Her mouth went pointy at the corners. It was close to smiling as she would get. We'll see, she said, as she left the cabinet room. Well, that's settled then. We can open the park, Joe asked. But it's going to take a few days to arrange, Jenkins said. Well, let's have a big ceremony. Invite the press, have someone special to do all the honours, in fact. I know the perfect person to declare the park open, Joe grinned. Consider it done, Prime Minister, Jenkins said, looking at his watch and then saying something quietly to Joe. Cabinet dismissed, Joe shouted, looking at Jenkins in amazement. Go and enjoy your playtime. You've earned it. Joe turned to AJ. We're going to meet the Queen. And I will be reading chapter 10 next week.